Hello, dear friends. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here. Every time you listen, every time you share your thoughts, it reminds me why these stories matter. If you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe so that each tale of love, sacrifice, and family finds its way to your home the moment it's told. Tonight's story is called The Wooden Box in the Attic When Sacrifice Was Sealed in Silence. It begins as many stories in old families do on a day meant for remembrance. The house was crowded that afternoon. Relatives had come from near and far, the kind of gathering that only happens once a year, the ancestral memorial when names of the past are spoken aloud, and incense burns slow, leaving its smoke curling against the rafters. Children darted between legs. The smell of simmering broth drifted from the kitchen, and in the center of it all, Max sat quietly, his silver hair bent toward the altar, his hands folded in silent prayer for those who had gone before. Upstairs, though, another sound broke the rhythm of ritual. A boy's voice. His grandson rang out with excitement. "Mom, Dad, come look at this." Curiosity rippled through the room as heads tilted upward. A moment later, the boy came scrambling down the stairs, both arms straining to hold a dust-covered box. It was wooden old edges worn smooth by decades of handling, and on its front, a small lock clung stubbornly, its iron body rusted, the key long lost. He set it on the floor with a heavy thud. Dust rose in the sunlight, streaming through the window, and suddenly the quiet prayers of the room were replaced with whispers. Max turned his head, his eyes catching the side of the box. A flicker passed across his face, recognition, perhaps even sorrow, but he said nothing. The boy's mother, Max's daughter-in-law, was quicker to speak. She crossed the room, her eyes narrowing with a smile that did not reach them. "Well, well. What's this?" she said, tapping the lid with her manicured finger. "An old treasure chest." The grandson grinned. "It was in the attic way, in the corner. It's heavy. Maybe it's full of coins." Laughter rose nervously among the relatives, the kind of laughter that masks eagerness. The daughter-in-law straightened, her voice pitched higher, brighter, carrying across the room. "Open it," she said to Max, her tone casual but edged. "Come on, Dad. Surely it's time we all saw what's inside." "Maybe it's your retirement money," a few people chuckled, but the sound was thin. All eyes turned to Max now, their gazes drawn, as if the weight of that little wooden box pulled them in. Conversations hushed. Even the children went still. The air grew thick with expectation. Max sat frozen in his chair, the firelight catching in his weary eyes. He looked at the box, its wood scarred, its lock rusted, and for a moment no one could tell if he was remembering or resisting. The room leaned closer, silent, waiting. And then came the line that sliced the gathering open, a sentence that shifted the day from ritual to reckoning. "Open it, Dad." The daughter-in-law pressed, her voice clear, almost sharp. "Let's see what you've been hiding all these years." The words dropped heavy, and with them every eye in the room fastened on Max and the box at his feet. What was once a day for honoring the dead had turned in an instant into a trial of the living. The silence stretched after her words. The wooden box sat at the center of the room like a judge on its bench, commanding attention without a sound. Emma, Max's daughter-in-law, folded her arms, her smile tight. "Really, Dad, what are we waiting for? All these years you've kept things hidden. We could use the help now. Don't you think?" Her husband, Max's son, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat, but didn't speak, letting her voice carry. The boy hovered nearby, eyes shining with curiosity, whispering to his cousins about treasure chests and pirate gold. Max lowered his gaze to the box. The grain of the wood caught the light, and in its patterns he saw not treasure but time, decades folded into silence. His rough hands flexed against his knees, and the weight of memory pressed forward unbidden. He was young again, 30 years earlier, standing beneath the humming lights of the factory. The clock above the door read near midnight. Most men had gone home hours ago, but Max remained. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, the tang of iron and oil heavy in the air. Each clang of the machine echoed through his bones, and his hands, already raw, kept moving. Another shift, another hour, another dollar. He remembered the foreman's raised brow. "Sully, don't you ever rest?" Max had only smiled faintly, though his body ached. Rest wasn't something he could afford. His boy was in high school, then tuition due. His wife's medicine was never cheap. So Max worked while others slept, stacking pay stubs like bricks to build a future his family might stand on. The box upstairs, that was where he'd place the stubs. One by one, folded carefully as proof that nothing had ever come easy. Now, decades later, those very stubs still rested inside. But his daughter-in-law's eyes glittered with impatience, not gratitude. "Dad," she pressed again, her tone sharp as a knife scraping wood. "It's not like you're going to need it anymore. You've had your time. Think about your family now." The word family hung in the air, twisted. Max's jaw tightened, his silence heavier than any protest. His grandson piped up, innocent but eager. "Grandpa, is it gold? Did you hide gold in there?" The laughter that followed stung. Not cruel, not intentional, but careless. The kind of laughter that forgets the weight another man carries. Max's son avoided his father's eyes, staring at the floor, as if the knots in the wood might hold answers. Emma filled the gap with her own insistence. "We're drowning in bills. You can't expect us to struggle while you sit on whatever's in that box." She leaned closer, her voice low but clear enough for all to hear. "You worked your whole life, Dad. Surely you saved something worth sharing." Max's fingers tapped the arm of his chair, the rhythm steady, controlled. Inside, the memory of long nights at the factory roared louder than the storm outside. He thought of the nights he came home after sunrise, his hands black with grease, his wife already setting out breakfast for their boy. He thought of the moments when his body nearly gave out, yet he pressed on. Not for gold, not for treasure, but for them. And now they stood before him, not remembering the man who gave, but demanding the box as though it owed them something. The betrayal stung deeper than Emma's words. It was in his son's silence, in the hungry eyes of the room, and the way the box had turned from memory to prize. Max lifted his gaze, at last, the lines of his face sharp in the flickering firelight. His voice did not rise, but it carried. "What's in that box," he said slowly, "is not what you think." The room hushed again, but the hunger did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper, fed by his refusal. And in the silence, the wooden box seemed to breathe heavier, the lock glinting like a secret that refused to stay buried. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth could not soften the chill that settled across the room. Every gaze remained locked on the wooden box, as if the rusted lock itself might spring open at any moment. Emma leaned back, arms crossed, her tone laced with impatience. "You can say it's not what we think, Dad, but that doesn't change the truth. You kept this locked away all these years. Why people don't guard things unless they're valuable." Her words echoed, feeding the murmur of curiosity that rippled among the relatives. The boy shifted eagerly on his toes, craning to see more closely. Max's eyes lingered on his son, the man he had once carried through storms, now silent, sitting at his wife's side. The son's head bowed, his shoulders slumped, but his lips stayed sealed. He offered no defense, no reminder of what his father had once endured for him. And with that silence, another memory came. It was a winter's morning years ago, gray skies pressing low, the kind of rain that seemed to fall sideways, soaking everything in its path. Max had woken before dawn to find his son feverish, shivering beneath the thin quilt. The boy had begged not to miss school. An exam that day could not be skipped. So Max wrapped him in his own coat, lifted him onto his back, and stepped out into the storm. The rain slapped against his face, cold needles on his skin. Mud clung to his boots. Water seeped into every seam, but Max pressed forward. His arms ached from holding the boy's weight, yet he never loosened his grip. Each step was a battle against the wind, but each step was also a promise that his son would not be left behind. When they reached the school, soaked and shivering, the teacher gasped at the sight of them. She offered tea, a blanket, a dry place to sit. But Max shook his head, pressing the boy gently forward. "He'll take his exam," he said simply. "He's worked too hard to miss it." The boy had turned back once, his eyes wide, with something between love and awe. And in that look, Max had found enough strength to walk home again through the storm. Now, decades later, that same boy sat silent while his wife accused. Emma's voice broke through the memory, sharp against the quiet. "If it's not money, then prove it. Open the box and let us see. Otherwise, Everyone will keep wondering what you're hiding. Secrets only divide families, Dad. Max's son shifted uneasily, his hands twisting together in his lap. He glanced at his father, but quickly looked away as if ashamed to meet his eyes. Not once did he speak in his father's defense. Max's chest tightened. Betrayal was not always a shout, not always an act. Sometimes it was silence. Silence from the one voice that should have remembered most. The rain of that old morning echoed in his ears, the weight of his son on his back, the cold that had seeped into his bones. He had carried him once body and soul through storms that would have broken weaker men. And now, when he needed no carrying, only remembering the son gave him nothing. The room seemed to lean forward, hungry for his answer. But Max sat straighter in his chair, his silver hair catching the flicker of firelight, his eyes fixed on the box. Some storms, he said quietly, are heavier than gold. The relatives frowned, puzzled. Emma scoffed, shaking her head. You talk in riddles, Dad. Just open it and stop making this harder than it needs to be. The grandson tugged at the box's lid, rattling the rusty lock. The sound clattered through the room like chains dragging across stone, and Max, staring at the boy's eager hands, felt the storm rise again. Not outside this time, but within. The box rattled under the boy's eager hands, the rusty lock clinking like a stubborn bell that refused to open. Laughter rippled around the room, light but sharp, feeding the air of expectation. Emma smirked, her voice sweetened but edged. See, even he knows. Children can sense treasure. Go on, Dad, don't let him down. Her husband said nothing. He adjusted his glasses, eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the weight of his father's gaze. Max's breath came slow, his chest tight. His grandson's face shone with innocence, eyes wide with wonder, cheeks flushed from excitement. Is it gold, Grandpa? The boy asked, tugging again at the lid. Did you hide gold in here all this time? The room chuckled, but Max's heart clenched. Not because of the boy's question, a child's curiosity was natural, but because of the way the adults leaned into it, the way their silence confirmed the boy's fantasy, as though his grandfather was nothing more than a vault, waiting to be cracked. The sound of the lock clinking triggered another memory, one tied to the rhythm of wheels on asphalt. Max was back in his 30s again, standing on a dim street corner long after midnight. His body ached from two back-to-back, shifts, his hands still bearing the smell of machine oil. The bus screeched as it pulled up, doors creaking open. He climbed aboard, dropped coins into the slot, and slumped into a seat near the back. The lights flickered overhead. The bus was nearly empty, just a few strangers nodding off their heads, lolling with fatigue. Max's own eyelids grew heavy, but in his breast pocket he felt the week's wages folded, carefully counted, twice destined for tuition. Every mile the bus carried him was a mile between sacrifice and home. He would arrive near dawn, Anna already stirring in the kitchen, the boy rubbing sleep from his eyes. Max would press the bills into a tin on the counter and kiss his wife's hand, pretending his exhaustion was nothing. He saved every bus ticket, slipping each one into the wooden box in the attic. Not for their worth in dollars, but as proof of the miles he had traveled, the nights he had endured, the roads he had taken, so his son could walk a smoother path. Now those tickets sat in silence, yellowed with time, waiting to be seen. And all anyone here could imagine was gold. Max's grandson tugged again at the lock, his voice bubbling with joy. Please, Grandpa, just show us. I bet it's shiny. Emma clapped her hands lightly, feeding the moment. See how excited he is. Don't disappoint the boy, Dad. Families are supposed to share joy, not hoard it. Her words cut deeper than she knew. Max's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the chair's arms until his knuckles whitened. He thought of the countless nights he had shared, not joy, but exhaustion, sweat, and hunger. He had given everything, and he had done it quietly. That was his joy, to know his family needed nothing more. But here before him stood a room blind to sacrifice. They saw only treasure where there was toil, only money where there was memory. Max's son shifted in his seat, his silence as loud as thunder. His eyes flicked once toward his father, then away again. No words of defense. No reminder to his wife, to his child, of the man who had carried them all. Max's heart ached, but his voice remained steady. "The only gold in that box," he said slowly, "is the kind no thief would ever want." The boy frowned, puzzled. Emma rolled her eyes. A cousin muttered under his breath. But Max sat tall, the firelight dancing across his lined face. He knew what lay inside the box, and he knew it was heavier than gold. The others, blinded by greed or ignorance, would not understand, not yet. The room was restless now, the murmurs swelling like waves. The boy's innocent plea for gold had passed, but the hunger in the adult's eyes had not faded. They leaned closer, whispering to each other, speculating, waiting for Max to surrender. Emma tapped her nails against the wooden lid, the sound sharp and patient. "Dad, we're not playing games here. We're drowning in debt. Bills keep piling up. That box," she jabbed a finger at it, "could be the answer. Why hide it from your own family?" Her words hung in the air, biting and bold. Max's son winced, but he still said nothing. The silence from him stung deeper than his wife's demands. Max's eyes drifted to the fire, but his mind pulled backward to a kitchen table decades earlier. The table had been bare then except for a stack of ration coupons carefully clipped from newspapers. Anna had sat across from him, her face pale with exhaustion, while their boy swung his legs impatiently under the bench, not yet old enough to understand hunger. Max had spread the coupons out like cards in a deck, calculating meals for the week. Rice here, a little sugar there. Meat was rare vegetables stretched thin. Sometimes, when the boy wasn't looking, Max would cut his own portion, and half sliding the rest onto Anna's plate. She would shake her head refusing, but Max would press it into her hand until she gave in. When even the coupons ran short, he sold what little he had, an old pocket knife, a radio that barely worked, even the wedding band Anna had once worn before her illness. Each sale left an emptiness, but each one kept the boy fed, the house standing, the lights burning. Max had tucked some of those coupons, the last scraps of lean months, into the wooden box. Not because they were worth anything, but because they told the story of how survival had been carved from sacrifice. Now, as Emma stood before him, demanding what was owed, he could almost feel those thin slips of paper between his fingers again. The paper had been fragile, but the weight behind it had been heavier than gold. Emma leaned forward, her voice rising. "We're family. That means we share. If you've been saving money all this time, it's time to stop hoarding. Open the box and help us." Max's son shifted in his seat, glancing nervously between his wife and his father. His lips parted as if he might finally speak, but no words came. Instead, he sank back, letting Emma's voice speak for them both. The betrayal was quiet but sharp. Silence again, his son's silence, allowing sacrifice to be mocked, reduced to nothing more than hoarding. The boy, still standing by the box, looked up at his grandfather, confused. "Grandpa, why don't you just open it? It will make everyone happy." The innocence of the question cut deeper than the accusation. Max's heart clenched at the thought that even his grandson, too young to know better, was being swept into the greed of the moment. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. His eyes rose to meet Emma's, then the rest of the room. The firelight flickered across his lined face, etching every scar of labor, every year of endurance. "What sits in that box," he said at last, his voice quiet but unyielding, "was bought with hunger, with long nights, with things you'll never understand unless you live them. It is not for debts. It is not for bargains." Emma scoffed, rolling her eyes. "More riddles, Dad. You can't eat memories. You can't pay bills with stories. Stop making this harder." The murmur swelled again, relatives whispering, some nodding with Emma, others uncertain. But Max leaned back in his chair, his rough hands folded on his lap. The weight of memory pressed heavy on him, but his resolve remained firm. He would not reduce his life's labor to coins in their pockets. The box creaked softly as the boy patted it with small hands, unaware of the storm raging among the adults. And Max, staring at that innocent face, felt the ache of sacrifice and betrayal twined tighter together, one remembered in silence, the other unfolding before his very eyes. The whispers in the room thickened, swirling like smoke that refused to clear. Some nodded at Emma's words. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, unwilling to side openly, but drawn by the scent of imagined wealth. The box sat in the middle of it all, not just wood and iron, but a stage for everyone's greed and silence. Emma straightened her back, her tone sharpening. Dad, you've had your turn with this life. You raised your son, you've eaten, you've lived. Now it's our turn. Why keep clinging to the past when your family needs help? Now her husband kept his gaze, lowered lips pressed tight. He rubbed his hands together as if the act might hide his discomfort. But still, he said nothing. Max's heart sank at that silence. His son had once been the reason he endured nights of loneliness, yet now he could not lift a single word in his father's defense. The fire cracked, and in its glow memory stirred. Max saw himself years earlier sitting alone at the kitchen table after Anna's death. The house was too quiet then, too heavy. Friends had urged him to remarry. "You're still young, Max," they said. "A boy needs a mother. You need someone to share the load." One woman, kind, steady, with a smile like spring, had even offered her hand. She would have made life easier. A second wage, another presence in the house, someone to ease the ache of empty nights. But Max had looked at his son, still small, still grieving the mother who'd just been taken from him, and the answer was clear. He could not bring another face into that boy's sorrow. He could not let his son think love was replaceable, that sacrifice could be split in half. So Max chose the harder road. He turned away from companionship, from comfort, and carried the years alone. Every laugh he missed, every touch he longed for, was given up so his son would grow certain of one thing: his father's devotion was unbroken. That vow, too, he had tucked into the box upstairs, not on paper, not in ink, but in silence. And now, decades later, the very son for whom he had sacrificed stood mute, while his wife demanded inheritance from a box that held no gold. Emma leaned in, her voice loud enough to slice through memory. "Are you really going to sit there and say nothing?" "Honey," she shot her husband a sharp glance, then turned back to Max. "If you won't open it for yourself, then open it for him. For your son." Her words carried the sting of betrayal twice over, first in her demand, and then in his son's lowered eyes, his silence granting her permission to speak for him. Max's jaw tightened, his breath steady but heavy. He thought of the nights he sat in his chair staring at Anna's picture, refusing the company of another, choosing instead to pour every ounce of love into his boy. And this was the return: not gratitude, not defense, but silence. The boy's grandson shuffled closer, looking from mother to grandfather with confusion. "Why is everyone mad?" he asked softly. "It's just a box." The innocence in his voice sliced deeper than any accusation. To the child it was only curiosity. To the adults it had become currency. Max's weary eyes lifted to meet his son's at last. The silence between them was louder than words. He held his gaze, waiting, but his son looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. Max spoke then, his voice rough, but steady, every word heavy with years. "Do not ask me to trade my life's vow for your debts. This box does not belong to money. It belongs to memory. And if you cannot defend that, then at least do not betray it." The room hushed, unease shifting like a restless wind. Emma crossed her arms tighter, her lips pressed in irritation. The relatives looked at one another, caught between greed and guilt. The box, untouched, seemed to grow heavier with every heartbeat. And Max, though weary, sat straighter, his dignity unbroken even as betrayal pressed closer around him. The fire hissed as a log split, sparks flaring briefly before settling into embers. Yet the warmth in the room did nothing to ease the chill crawling through Max's chest. His son's silence still rang louder than Emma's sharp words, and the box remained in the center like a judge none could ignore. A cousin cleared his throat and leaned closer. "Well, maybe Emma's right. You worked your whole life, Uncle Max. It makes sense you put some money aside. We're not accusing you of hiding," but he glanced at the box, lowering his voice. "What's the harm in letting everyone see?" Another relative chimed in. "Exactly. It could help the kids. College bills, a down payment. Surely that's what you meant it for anyway." Emma nodded quickly, seizing their agreement. "See, we're not greedy, Dad. We're just being practical. You saved for us, didn't you?" The words stung not for their volume, but for what they erased. They spoke as though money had always flowed easily, as though savings had been a matter of choice, not of breaking a body to provide. Max's eyes dropped to his hands. Even now, decades after retirement, the skin bore the map of his labor calluses, thick as bark scars, cutting across his palms, nails forever ridged. And memory surged. He was back in the mill on a winter night, the air thick with smoke and the hiss of steam. Machines roared, the floors slick with oil. His hands gripped iron tools until the skin split open, blood mixing with grease. He worked through the pain-wrapping rags tight around his palms because quitting meant no paycheck, and no paycheck meant no food on the table. When the whistle blew at dawn, he staggered outside his body, trembling lungs raw from the dust. He would wash his hands in cold water, biting back the sting, and slip the crumpled bills into his pocket. At home, Anna would meet him at the door, worry in her eyes. He would smile, hiding the ache, and press the wages into her hands. She would set aside a few coins for food, a few for medicine, and tuck the rest into the box upstairs. Those hands, cracked, bleeding, scarred, had built everything his family now enjoyed. And those stubs, those wages, those fragments of survival were what filled the box they now demanded like beggars at a feast. The relatives pressed closer, their whispers louder now. There must be cash in there. Maybe bonds. What if it's his will? Emma folded her arms with triumph, feeding the frenzy. He's been keeping it from us all along. Why else would he lock it? It's time the truth came out. Max's grandson leaned forward again, eyes wide innocent. Grandpa, is it for me? Is it my inheritance? The words pierced Max deeper than any demand. The boy's small voice carried not greed, but the echo of what others had planted. Already the hunger for money had trickled down into innocence, twisting curiosity into expectation. Max lifted his gaze, the firelight carving shadows across his lined face. His voice, though quiet, silenced the room. These hands, he said, holding them up, the scars clear in the glow, gave you everything. What sits in that box is not wealth. It is the proof of what these hands endured. The relatives fidgeted, glancing at one another. Some looked away ashamed. Others only grew more impatient. Emma gave a dry laugh, shaking her head. Hands and stories don't pay the bills, Dad. You can talk about scars all you want, but sooner or later, you'll have to open it. And when you do, everyone will see whether you're telling the truth or keeping treasure from your own blood. The murmurs flared again. The air charged, as if the walls themselves leaned in to hear. And Max, weary but unbending, sat taller in his chair. The storm was far from over, but he would not surrender the meaning of his life to their greed. The air inside the room thickened with tension. The relatives' voices rose in little bursts, greedy speculation, dressed up as concern. The fire in the hearth hissed smoke, curling faintly as though even the flames were uneasy. Emma leaned over the box again, tapping the lock with her fingernail, the sharp tick-tick echoing like a countdown. A lock this old, she said with a thin smile. No one keeps it closed unless there's something worth hiding. Admitted Dad, it must be a fortune. The cousins chuckled. Someone muttered maybe gold coins. Another added or stock certificates. Max's son shifted in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. His silence was louder than all their chatter. Max's breath deepened, the weight of memory rising like a tide he could no longer hold back. His eyes dimmed, not with defeat, but with the pain of what they had already forgotten. The lock's faint shine reminded him of another piece of metal, one he had carried for years, Anna's wedding ring. He was back in that sterile hospital corridor, the walls white and humming with fluorescent light. Anna lay in the bed, her face pale, the sound of machines clicking steady behind her. Bills stacked higher than medicine bottles, each one heavier than the last. He had stood at the counter, his calloused hands trembling, as he slid the small gold ring across to the pharmacist. The man waited with a practiced eye, scribbled numbers on a slip, and handed Max the medicine his wife needed. Max had walked back to Anna's room, the coins gone, the ring gone, but the medicine in his pocket. He placed the pills in her palm, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You're worth more than gold." Anna smiled faintly, her eyes soft, though she knew what he had given up. Her fingers brushed the empty place on her hand, but she said nothing. Sacrifice was their language, and silence was how they spoke it. Later, when she was gone, Max placed the receipt from that night in the wooden box. A small slip of paper, but to him it weighed more than treasure. It was proof of what love had cost. Now, decades later, Emma's voice mocked in his ears. It must be a fortune. He lifted his head, his weary eyes meeting hers. "A fortune, yes," he said quietly. but not the kind you can spend. Emma scoffed, rolling her eyes. More riddles. Always riddles. The relatives shifted, caught between curiosity and discomfort. Some avoided his gaze, uneasy with the steel in his tone. Others leaned closer, hungry for answers, unwilling to let the lock remain closed. His grandson tilted his head, innocence untainted by greed. "Grandpa," he asked softly, "if it's not money, what is it?" Max's heart trembled at the question. He wanted to take the boy's small hands and show him the slips of paper, the bus tickets, the receipts, each one a brick in the house of sacrifice. But the time had not yet come. Instead, he drew a slow breath, his voice carrying low and steady. "It is everything your grandmother and I gave, so you could all be here today." Emma waved a hand, dismissive. "Grand gestures and sad stories won't pay off credit cards, Dad. You can sit there and talk about sacrifice all night, but in the end you can't eat paper, and you can't keep a family together with memories." The words cut sharp, but Max did not flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his rough hands folded, the firelight glinting in his eyes. Because he knew the truth, paper and memories had kept this family alive once. And though they mocked it now, one day when the box opened, they would see it for themselves. The incense on the altar burned low, a thin ribbon of smoke, twisting toward the rafters. Outside, the snow tapped gently against the windows, but inside the house the air was thick with expectation. The wooden box, untouched, sat like a silent guest at the table, its lock gleaming faintly in the firelight. Emma's voice rose again, her tone sharp enough to slice through the hush of prayer. "We're wasting time. Dad, just open it. Everyone's thinking the same thing. Why keep us waiting?" Her words stirred the room. A few cousins nodded. One uncle leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, curiosity etched across his face. Even the children clustered near the door, sensing the tension that crackled like static in the air. Max's hands clenched against his knees. He stared at the box, but what he saw was not the present. Memory pulled him back again, back to nights when the box had first begun to fill. He saw Anna's face in the dim light of their bedroom, her skin pale, her breath shallow. The smell of medicine clung to the air, sharp and bitter. Max sat at the small desk by the bed, his shoulders hunched, a candle guttering beside him. Before him lay a stack of hospital receipts, each one marked paid, though he could not recall how his body had endured the work to make it so. He traced the numbers with his finger, each figure another piece of his strength carved away. His hands trembled as he folded the slips neatly one by one and tucked them into the wooden box in the attic. It was all he could do to preserve them, not as reminders of debt, but as testimony of what love had cost. Anna stirred in the bed. Her eyes, though heavy, met his. "Max," she whispered, "you're giving too much." He took her hand, rough against her fragile fingers, and pressed it to his lips. "There's no such thing as too much," he said softly. "Not for you. Not for him." Her eyes glistened and a faint smile curved her lips. Then she drifted back into sleep, leaving Max alone with the flicker of the candle, the stack of receipts, and the silence of sacrifice. Now, decades later, those same slips of paper rested in the box at his feet, waiting to be discovered. But instead of reverence, his family's voices carried only hunger. "Dad," Emma pressed, tapping the lid again with her nail. Tick, tick. "You can't expect us to believe it's just papers. Nobody guards scraps like this. Show us what you've been hiding." His son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking toward his wife, then down again. Still, no defense, no protest, just silence. The betrayal was sharper now, the contrast unbearable. Once Max had sat through nights of exhaustion, counting hospital bills by candlelight, whispering vows of devotion. Now his son sat mute while his wife accused him of hoarding. Max's chest ached, but his voice, when it came, was calm. "You think this box holds treasure? And it does. But not the kind you'll spend in shops or banks." Emma rolled her eyes, exhaling sharply. "More riddles. Always riddles." The room murmured again, relatives leaning closer, their curiosity boiling into pressure. Someone whispered, "Maybe it's his will." Another, "Could be savings bonds." Max's grandson tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide with innocence. Grandpa, why not just open it, then everyone will be happy? Max turned to the boy, his gaze softening for a moment. He reached out and brushed the boy's hair back gently, his rough hand trembling. One day, he murmured, "You'll understand what real treasure is." The boy tilted his head puzzled, but said no more. The box remained locked, the family restless, the storm outside growing heavier. And Max, seated in the firelight, felt the old ache of sacrifice clash with the sting of betrayal, each heartbeat carrying him closer to the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The smell of incense faded into the heavier sense of food. Bowls of rice, steaming meats, and dishes of vegetables were set upon the long wooden table. It should have been a moment of unity, the ancestral meal where past and present joined in reverence. Yet as everyone gathered, the wooden box remained at the table's center, untouched, but unavoidable, stealing the place of honor that should have belonged to memory. The cousins filled their plates, but their eyes kept drifting toward the box. Chopsticks hovered midair, conversations stuttered, and the crackling fire was drowned by whispers. Emma sat proudly at one end of the table, her chin lifted. She glanced at the box as if it were already hers. "It doesn't make sense," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Dad worked 40 years. No man works that long just to leave behind scraps. There's something in there. I can feel it." A murmur rose in agreement. One aunt leaned closer, lowering her voice, though not enough to escape Max's ears. "It could be his retirement money. Maybe bonds. He's been quiet all these years. Maybe he was saving in secret." Another chimed in, shaking his head but smiling slyly. "Or gold. Back in the day, people kept gold bars hidden at home. Maybe that's why he locked it." The whispers spread like embers across dry grass. Even the younger relatives who barely knew Max beyond family stories leaned in, curiosity shining in their eyes. Max sat at the head of the table, his silver hair bent toward his bowl. He lifted a piece of fish, but the taste turned to ash in his mouth. The noise of speculation grew, drowning out the prayers that should have marked this night. He thought of Anna, how she used to guide the family's memorial meals. She would smile warmly, ensuring every child was fed, reminding them gently, "This is not about what we gain, but about what we remember." Now her chair was empty, her voice gone, and in its place, greed hummed like an untuned string. The boy, Max's grandson, looked from face to face, confusion creasing his brow. He poked at his rice, then asked in his small voice, "Why does everyone care so much about a box? Isn't tonight supposed to be about Grandma and the ancestors?" The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into water. For a fleeting moment, silence rippled outward. A few relatives looked down ashamed. But Emma quickly filled the void, her tone brisk. "Sweetheart, your grandpa's box is part of the family too. If it helps us survive, isn't that honoring the ancestors?" Max's heart clenched at the twisting of words. The boy's innocence was bent, reshaped to suit hunger. He set down his chopsticks and lifted his gaze. The firelight caught in his weary eyes, his face stern but calm. "This table," he said quietly, "was meant for memory, not for scavenging." The room stilled. A log popped in the hearth. Emma laughed lightly, though the edge in her voice betrayed her. "We're not scavenging, Dad. We're simply asking for the truth. You can't blame people for wondering when you keep a locked box in the attic all these years. Why not ease everyone's minds and open it now before the meal begins?" The cousins nodded, emboldened. One uncle thumped the table with his fist. "Yes, yes. Open it tonight. Let's all see what kind of legacy you've left." Even Max's son looked up this time, his eyes pleading, but not for understanding, for peace. "Dad," he murmured, maybe it's better just to show them." The betrayal landed like a blade. His son, the boy he had carried through storms, the reason for every sacrifice, had joined the chorus. The box sat in silence, its lock gleaming. Outside, the snow fell harder, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Max straightened in his chair. The weight of years pressed on his shoulders, but his voice held steady. "Be careful," he said, each word measured what you asked to see. "Some truths weigh heavier than gold." The murmurs rose again, restless, disbelieving. The meal lay untouched, forgotten. The memorial had become something else entirely, not a night of remembrance, but a trial. And at the center of it all, the wooden box waited. The clamor at the table pressed closer, each whisper sharper, each demand louder. The wooden box had become the true centerpiece of the memorial, and the meal sat cooling untouched. Then from the far end of the table, a voice cut gently through the noise. "May I say something?" Heads turned. It was Mr. Carter, the old neighbor, stooped with age, but still steady in his chair. His hair was thin, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on his cane. He had come to pay respects invited out of courtesy, but until now he had remained silent watching. Emma shifted in her seat, irritation flickering across her face. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said lightly, though her tone was tight. The old man nodded, his eyes settling on Max. "I remember a night many winters ago," he began. "I was sick worse than I'd ever been. Fever, coughing fits. My wife was terrified. We had no car, and the snow that night was too deep to walk for help. The room grew quiet. Even the children hushed, sensing a story. Mr. Carter's voice cracked with memory, but he pressed on. It was close to midnight when I heard a knock on my door. I opened it, and there stood Max. He had pedaled through the storm on his bicycle, the wind cutting snow up to his knees, just to bring me medicine from the pharmacy in town. He left his own dinner to do it. And when I tried to pay him back, he shook his head and said, 'Neighbors don't keep accounts. We keep each other.'" A murmur rippled through the room, softer, this time less hungry. Eyes turned back to Max, who sat silently, his hands folded in his lap. His face betrayed no pride, only the weight of recollection. Mr. Carter leaned on his cane, his voice trembling. "If there's a box upstairs, I'll tell you what's inside. It's not money. It's nights like that. Nights when he gave what no one else would." Emma's lips tightened, color rising to her cheeks. "With respect, Mr. Carter," she said briskly, "stories don't pay bills. We're talking about the future of this family, not." But her words faltered under the weight of the silence that followed. One cousin shifted uneasily. Another aunt cleared her throat, her eyes softening as they flicked toward Max. For the first time that evening, someone looked at him not with greed, but with respect. Max did not move. He only let out a long breath, the lines of his face deep in the firelight. His eyes met Mr. Carter's, and for a fleeting second the two old men shared an understanding too heavy for words. The boy, Max's grandson, leaned closer to his grandfather. "Is that true, Grandpa? You rode your bike in the snow just to help?" Max's hand brushed lightly over the boy's shoulder. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Yes, because sometimes love means pedaling through the storm." The boy's eyes widened, filled with something brighter than curiosity, now awe. Emma exhaled sharply, breaking the moment. "Fine," she muttered. "A good deed is a good deed. But that doesn't explain the lock on the box, does it?" The relative's eyes darted back to the box, but something had shifted. The hunger was still there, but thinner, tempered by doubt. The sound of Mr. Carter's memory lingered, softening the edges of greed. The box remained closed. The meal remained untouched. And yet, for the first time that night, the balance of the room had changed. Max sat tall in his chair, his silence steady. He did not need to defend himself. The truth whispered through another man's memory had begun to speak for him. The room lingered in a fragile quiet after Mr. Carter's story, as though his words had pressed down upon the table, heavier than any dish of food. The box still sat at the center, but for the first time its weight was measured not in imagined coins, but in sacrifice. Then came another voice, soft but clear. "I remember something too." Heads turned toward the doorway, where Mrs. Holloway, the retired schoolteacher, stood with a scarf wrapped around her neck. She had come late, bringing a small basket of fruit to place at the altar, but now her eyes were fixed on Max. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn," she said, "but I taught his boy all those years ago. And every morning when I reached the school gate, there he was." She pointed toward Max, her eyes warm with memory. Rain or shine, snow or storm, Max never missed a day. He stood outside, waiting until the bell rang, making sure his son was safe. The cousins shifted in their seats. One of the younger relatives frowned. "Every day that seems impossible." Mrs. Holloway nodded firmly. every day. There were mornings when the rain poured so hard the street turned to rivers. I remember umbrellas flipping inside out, children running, soaked to the bone. And there he was, drenched, holding a paper bag with lunch inside, waving at his boy. There were winter mornings when frost bit at the windows, and still he stood his breath, a cloud in the cold, just to see his son inside before walking to the mill. Even when he must have been exhausted, he never failed. Her voice trembled as she placed the basket of fruit at the altar. It wasn't for recognition. No one paid him to stand there. He did it because he loved his son more than his own rest. Max's son shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing. He looked down, his hands twisting together. Emma glanced at him sharply, as if silently demanding he speak, but he said nothing. The silence in the room was different now. Not greedy, not impatient, but heavy with a kind of reverence. The children at the far end of the table leaned in, whispering to each other in awe. The boy, Max's grandson, tugged at his sleeve again. "You really waited every morning, Grandpa, even when it was raining." Max looked down at him, his rough hand brushing the child's hair. His voice was low, steady. "Yes, because no storm is stronger than a father's promise." The boy's eyes shone, his lips curving into a small, proud smile. Emma, her patience fraying, clicked her tongue. "Nice stories. But standing at a school gate doesn't explain this." She jabbed her finger toward the box again. "You can't expect us to believe you locked that thing for 40 years just to hold old papers and receipts. There has to be something more." Her words tried to reignite the hunger, but they landed weaker this time. The relatives looked at one another, shifting uneasily. The image of a father waiting in the rain year after year clung too tightly to their thoughts to be dismissed. Max's silence grew taller than her demands. He sat, his weary eyes on the fire, his dignity unbroken. "Mrs. Holloway lowered herself into a chair at the far side of the room. "Some treasures," she said softly, "aren't measured in money. They're measured in devotion. And that man," she nodded toward Max, "is rich beyond all of you." The words lingered in the smoke-filled air, pressing down heavier than any lock could. And though the box remained closed, the truth was beginning to crack open. The fire burned low, its glow steady but dim, as if listening itself. The wooden box still sat untouched, yet the mood around it had shifted. Stories from the old neighbor and the schoolteacher had chipped away at the greed that filled the room earlier. Then, from near the back of the gathering, another voice rose, gravelly firm. "I worked with him," said Mr. Lopez, Max's old co-worker from the mill. His shoulders were stooped, his jacket worn thin, but his eyes held the weight of truth. "We did the night shifts together for years, and I'll tell you this, I saw what he gave and what he refused to take." The room stilled again. Even Emma hesitated, her lips parting before she snapped them shut. Mr. Lopez leaned forward on his cane. There were weeks when overtime shifts came up, but instead of taking them for himself, Max let younger men sign up. They had babies at home, wives who couldn't work. He knew they needed the money more. And when the foreman tried to force him onto the schedule, he'd shake his head and say, "I'll manage." Give it to them. A murmur ran around the table. Some of the cousins frowned, their eyes flicking toward Max in surprise. Mr. Lopez's voice grew steadier. "One winter, my boy broke his arm. Hospital bills nearly buried me. I came to work half broken, trying to hide it, but Max noticed. At the end of the week, he slipped his pay envelope into my locker. I tried to give it back, but he wouldn't take it. He said, 'My boy is healthy. Yours needs it more.'" He paused, emotion tightening his throat. "That envelope saved my family, and I never forgot it. If you want to know what's in that box, it's those kinds of weeks. Sacrifices that no one asked for, but he gave anyway." Max's son shifted, shame prickling across his face. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Emma's tone was sharper than before, brittle. "That's very touching. But stories don't fill a box. If he wanted to remember all this, fine. But locking it up, hiding it from his own children, that doesn't make sense." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying how much weaker her argument sounded now. Max remained still, his rough hands folded in his lap. His eyes, weary yet steady, flicked once toward Mr. Lopez, and gave the faintest nod gratitude without words. The boy's voice broke into the quiet. Grandpa, did you really give away your pay? His young eyes were wide-filled, not with greed now, but wonder. Max turned to him, his lips curving faintly. Yes, because money comes and goes. But a man's worth is in what he gives, not what he keeps. The boy sat back slowly absorbing the words, as if they were heavier than gold. Around the table, some relatives lowered their gazes. The murmur of greed had dulled, replaced with something quieter, harder to dismiss. Emma pressed her lips together, her confidence slipping. But still, she jabbed a finger toward the box. Fine. Sacrifice is noble. But don't tell me you locked up pieces of paper just to prove you were generous. If it's all so meaningful, then let us see it. Mac's gaze lifted steady and calm, though his heart ached. He looked at his son, then at the grandson, who sat watching him with wide eyes. The day will come, he said softly, when the truth in that box will speak louder than any of you. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward as if punctuating his words. And though the box remained sealed, the truth was already leaking out, carried by the voices of those who had witnessed his sacrifices firsthand. The fire burned lower, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. The smell of incense still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of the untouched food. The box remained in the center of the table, its presence heavier than any dish, heavier even than the silence that followed Mr. Lopez's words. Then from near the doorway another figure spoke. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of conviction. May I share something? It was Pastor Green, who had come to offer prayers for the ancestors and stayed quietly in the corner listening. His clerical collar glimmered faintly in the firelight as he stepped forward, resting his hands gently on the back of a chair. Emma's face tightened. Of course, Pastor, she said quickly, though the edge in her tone betrayed her irritation. The pastor nodded toward Max, his eyes warm but solemn. I have known this man for most of my ministry, and I can tell you I've never met another who lived with such quiet integrity. There were times, lean times, when the church had little to give. Yet when we passed the plate for families in need, Max was always the first to drop something in, even when I knew he had barely enough for himself. He paused, his gaze sweeping the table. I remember once after a service I asked him, "Why do you give so much when you have so little?" Do you know what he said? The room held still waiting. Pastor Green's voice deepened, carrying the memory. He looked at me and said, "Because I know what it feels like to go without, and I won't let another man's child feel it if I can help it." A murmur rippled through the family. The words hung in the smoke-filled air, cutting deeper than gold ever could. Max sat quietly, his eyes lowered, his hands folded in his lap. He did not speak, but his silence was not shame. It was the dignity of a man who had never sought praise. The pastor stepped closer to the table, his hand brushing against the wooden box. "I do not know what's inside this," he said gently, "but I can promise you this: whatever it holds, it will not be measured in coins or bonds. It will be measured in sacrifice. And sacrifice, my friends, is the only inheritance worth keeping." Max's grandson looked up, his young brow furrowed. "Pastor, does that mean Grandpa's box is better than treasure?" The pastor smiled softly at the boy. "Yes, child, because treasure is spent once, but sacrifice shapes lives. It never runs out." The boy's face lit with quiet pride as he glanced back at his grandfather. But Emma, her patience fraying, leaned forward sharply. "With all respect, Pastor, sacrifices don't put food on the table. Bills don't care how noble someone was. We're talking about survival here, not philosophy." Her words rang hollow against the backdrop of testimony that had filled the room. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, their earlier eagerness dimming. One aunt dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Another cousin looked down ashamed at his own speculation. Pastor Green laid his hand firmly on the back of the chair, his gaze steady. "Survival without dignity is no survival at all. This man has given more than any of you can see. And if you cannot honor that, then perhaps you do not deserve to open what he has guarded." The room fell into a hush, the weight of his words pressing down. Max lifted his eyes at last, meeting the pastor's gaze. The faintest nod passed between them: respect, understanding, brotherhood. The box remained sealed, but the tide in the room had turned further. Greed still lingered, but it was shrinking under the shadow of truth. And for the first time that night, Max felt he was no longer standing alone. The evening wore on, and the house filled with the sounds of shifting chairs, clinking dishes, and murmurs. The memorial candles flickered at the altar, their flames bending with each draft of winter air that slipped beneath the door. The smell of incense lingered sharp and steady, weaving through the scent of untouched food. Max sat at the head of the table, his posture straight though his shoulders carried the weight of years. Around him, the voices of neighbors and witnesses still echoed in the minds of those present. Mr. Carter's memory of the storm, Mrs. Holloway's stories of the school gate, Mr. Lopez's confession of saved families, Pastor Green's words about dignity. Each account had cracked the hunger in the room but not broken it. Emma's lips pressed tight, her eyes sharp as they flicked between the box and the relatives. She could feel her advantage slipping. Each new story painted Max not as a hoarder of wealth, but as a giver of sacrifice. And yet the locked box still sat there, its silence a challenge no one could ignore. At last Emma pushed back her chair, the legs scraping the floor. The sound was harsh in the hush of the house. "We've heard enough speeches," she declared, her voice hard. "Stories are touching, yes, but they don't change the fact that a locked box is still a locked box. And this is the night of remembrance. What better time than now, with everyone present, to see the truth?" A ripple of agreement stirred. Some nodded reluctantly. Others avoided her gaze, but did not object. The cousins leaned in closer, their curiosity reigniting. Even Max's son shifted in his chair, his face pale, torn between shame and pressure. The boy sitting near Max looked from his mother to his grandfather, confusion clouding his young eyes. "But, Mom," he whispered, "Grandpa said it's not treasure. It's memories." Emma forced a smile down at him, though her tone was sharp. "Sweetheart, sometimes memories hide more than you think. Don't worry, we'll all see together." Max's chest tightened. He reached out, resting his rough hand gently on the boy's shoulder. His voice was quiet but firm. "Some memories, child, are heavier than gold. And once you open them, you cannot close them again." The boy stared up at him, wide-eyed, uncertain. The relatives shifted again, their hunger wrestling with unease. They had come for ritual, for prayers and remembrance, but the evening had transformed into something else entirely, a tribunal with the box as evidence and Max as the accused. Pastor Green cleared his throat, his voice calm but insistent. "Perhaps this is not the time. The altar should be the focus, not a box." Emma shot him a look, her patience thinning. "With respect, Pastor, this family deserves clarity. We've lived too long with questions. Tonight they end." Max's son raised his head at last, his lips parting. For a moment, it seemed he might defend his father. But then he faltered, his gaze sinking again, and he whispered instead, maybe we should just let her, Dad. Just open it and be done." The betrayal landed heavy, though Max's face betrayed no crack. Inside, though, the memory of every sacrifice pressed like stones against his chest. The candles at the altar burned lower wax, dripping down their sides like tears. The house creaked under the weight of winter wind. The stage was set. The witnesses' words lingered in the air, but Emma's demand grew louder. The relatives' whispers restless, the boy's innocence trembling between truth and doubt. And Max knew the moment he had guarded for decades, the moment when silence would no longer hold, was drawing near. The box would not remain closed much longer. The night had deepened. The storm outside rattled the windows, the sound of sleet tapping the glass like impatient fingers. Inside, the house was warm with firelight and breath, yet the tension made the air heavy. Every eye drifted toward the altar, then back again to the box on the table, as if the spirits of the ancestors themselves waited for what would happen next. Emma stood her shadow long against the wooden wall. "Enough," she said flatly, her tone carrying more authority than request. "We've circled around this all evening. It's time. Dad, bring the box down properly. Put an end to all this guessing." Her words struck the room like a gavel. Some relatives nodded, some murmured uneasily, but none spoke against her. The pressure gathered like storm clouds. Max's son cleared his throat, voice low but unsteady. Maybe she's right, Dad. Maybe it's better if everyone sees. Better to open it now than let it hang over us. The words twisted in Max's chest, more painful than Emma's demands. His son's voice carried no malice but no courage either. It was the voice of surrender. Max's grandson, sitting close, tugged gently at his sleeve. "Grandpa, you don't have to if you don't want to," the boy whispered, eyes wide in earnest. "It's your box." Max laid his rough hand over the child's, the callous skin trembling slightly. "I know, son," he murmured. "But sometimes silence cannot last forever." He rose slowly, his joints stiff as back, bent but unbroken. The room fell silent at the scrape of his chair. All eyes followed him. As he stepped away from the table, his footsteps measured steady. He climbed the narrow staircase, the boards creaking under his weight, and disappeared into the shadows of the attic. The family waited, murmuring softly, the storm filling the silence. Emma crossed her arms, satisfaction flickering across her face. Finally she muttered. Minutes passed before Max returned, his arms straining with the weight of the box. The wood was scarred and stained, its lock rusted, but it carried a gravity that silenced even the whispers. He moved slowly, reverently, as if carrying more than wood, as if carrying years themselves. He reached the table and set the box down in the center with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the room, sharp as a drumbeat. Dishes rattled, glasses trembled. The family leaned closer, breath held. The box sat there, playing yet commanding, its iron lock glinting in the firelight. Max did not sit immediately. He stood with his hand on the lid, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him. Some looked eager, some guilty, some uncertain. But all were waiting. "This box," he said, his voice low but carrying, "has been with me for 40 years. It has held more than paper. It has held nights, sacrifices, promises, and pain. You demand to see it. But I warn you, what lies inside may weigh heavier than any of you are prepared to carry." The words hung in the air, but the pressure only grew. Emma leaned forward, her lips curling. "Then let us see if we can carry it, Dad. Or are you afraid there's nothing inside at all?" The cousins murmured again, some smirking, others uncomfortable. Max's son looked down, unable to meet his father's eyes. The grandson stared at the box, torn between awe and fear. At last, Max lowered himself back into his chair. His hands rested on the wood, the veins rising across his skin like roots. He let the silence stretch, the fire crackle, the storm outside howl. Then slowly he pulled a small iron key from his coat pocket, a key no one had ever seen. He set it on the table beside the lock, the faint metallic clink ringing louder than thunder. Gasps rippled through the room. "You had the key all along," Emma breathed. Max's weary eyes lifted steady and sharp. "Of course. A lock without a key is not a guard but a grave. I never meant for this box to be buried, only kept safe until the time came." The storm outside raged, the flames in the hearth flared, and the air grew taut as a string. The family leaned forward as one, their eyes fixed on the box. And Max, sitting tall though tired, placed his hand firmly on the lid. The box had come down from the attic. The key lay ready. The truth, long sealed, hovered at the edge of revelation. The storm outside battered the windows harder now, wind whistling through the gaps in the old wooden frames. Inside the room was so still, it seemed the house itself was listening. The fire popped in the hearth, a sharp crack that made a few cousins flinch, but every eye remained fixed on the box. Max's hand hovered over the key. His fingers, rough and scarred, trembled faintly as they closed around the cool iron. For a long moment he did not move. The silence grew heavy, pressing down like snow on a sagging roof. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted the key and brought it toward the lock. The faint metallic scrape as the teeth slid in sent a ripple down the table. Breath caught in throats. The boy leaned forward, wide-eyed, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. The lock resisted at first, stiff with rust, but Max pressed gently, his hand steady. The click of metal engaging filled the room, sharp and final. It echoed louder than the storm. Emma exhaled in triumph, a thin smile tugging at her lips. At last she whispered. The cousins leaned closer, murmuring, "What's in there? It has to be money." Maybe gold, their voices buzzed like flies circling a lantern. Max paused, his hand still resting on the key. His gaze swept the table, meeting each face in turn, his son's lowered in shame, Emma's tight with hunger, the relatives wide with expectation, and his grandson's glowing with innocence and wonder. His voice came low but steady. Every sound this key makes is a story. Every turn a lifetime. You are eager for treasure. What you will see is heavier. He began to turn the key. Click. The sound was deep, ancient, final. The lock shifted slightly, its resistance breaking. A murmur rippled through the room. Some leaned back in anticipation. Others leaned forward so far they nearly tipped their chairs. Emma clutched her husband's arm, her voice a harsh whisper. It's happening. Finally, it's happening. Max's grandson whispered louder than her grandpa. Are you sure? Max's hand lingered on the key, and for a moment his weary eyes softened. He thought of Anna, her face pale in the hospital light, her smile by the school gate, her laughter on spring mornings when life was still kind. He thought of the bus tickets, the ration coupons, the overtime wages slipped to others, the ring he sold the nights he kept vigil alone. He thought of the box, not as a container, but as a vessel of years. And now at last he thought of the moment when those years would be seen. He gave the key one last turn. The lock groaned, the iron hinge loosening with a sound like a sigh. Gasps rose. Someone whispered. It's opening. Max removed the key, laying it gently on the table. His hand rested on the lid, now heavy but calm. Emma leaned forward, impatience sharpening her tone. Open it, Dad. Don't draw it out. We've waited long enough. Her words sparked murmurs again, the air restless. But others sat quietly, shaken by the witnesses' stories, their curiosity tangled with unease. Max sat straighter, the firelight etching lines across his face. His voice quiet, yet cutting silence them. This box does not open for greed. It opens for truth. And truth does not come quickly, it comes when it must. The room stilled again. Outside the storm howled. Inside the box lay unlocked, its secret hovering just beyond reach. The boy's small voice broke the silence. Grandpa, if it's memories, can I see them first? A hush fell deeper still. Emma's face tightened, her fingers curling into fists. But no one spoke. Max's rough hand brushed the boy's hair. Yes, he said softly. When the time comes, you will see before anyone else. The lid remained closed for now, but the lock, the barrier of decades, was broken. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew there was no turning back. The lock hung loose now, the old iron weight resting against the box as if exhausted from its duty. The room was taut, every breath held, every eye fixed on Max's scarred hands as they rested on the lid. The storm rattled the shutters, the fire hissed, but no one moved. Slowly, with the reverence of a priest opening an altar, Max lifted the lid. The hinges creaked stiff from years of disuse, the sound raw and final. A faint smell of old paper and dust drifted out, carrying with it the decades sealed inside. The family leaned forward as one, their chairs scraping against the floor. Emma gripped the table, her knuckles white, her breath quick. The cousins craned their necks, eyes shining with anticipation. Even Max's son straightened his shame, giving way to curiosity. And then they saw. Not gold, not cash, not bonds or wills, but paper-yellowed brittle edges curled with time, dozens of slips layered carefully stacked like fragile leaves preserved in autumn. Bus tickets, ration coupons, receipts faded to near invisibility. A murmur rose, confused, disappointed. One cousin frowned. What is this?" Emma's face twisted. She snatched one slip from the top, holding it up with a scoff. "Bus tickets, really, all these years. All this secrecy, and it's nothing but scraps." She tossed it back into the box, her voice rising sharp with anger. "This is what you guarded like treasure. You made us sit here. You made us beg for garbage." The boy gasped, his small hands reaching forward protectively. "Don't call it garbage," he cried. His wide eyes turned to Max, pleading. "Grandpa, what are they?" Max reached into the box, his fingers brushing over the brittle slips as if touching old friends. He lifted one bus ticket, carefully holding it in the firelight. "This," he said softly, "is a mile. A mile I rode home after working 2 shifts so your father could have tuition for school." He picked up another faded ration coupon. "And this is a meal. A piece of bread I went without so your grandmother and father could eat instead." The room hushed. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, the wind falling quieter against the house. Max laid the papers gently on the table, his rough hands trembling. "Every scrap here is a piece of life I gave away. Not gold, not money, but nights, meals, years." Emma's lips curled, her voice biting. "Nights and meals don't pay bills. You can dress it up however you like, but you locked away paper. Paper that means nothing now." Her words struck hard, but this time they didn't land the same. The relatives shifted uneasily, their gazes flicking between the papers and Max. The memory of the witnesses' stories, the storms, the gates, the envelopes of pay hung heavier now, undeniable. Mr. Lopez spoke from the back, his voice rough. "Those scraps fed my boy when nothing else could." Mrs. Holloway added softly, "Those miles kept his son safe every morning." Pastor Green nodded, his voice low but firm. "This is not garbage. This is sacrifice you could never count in dollars." Emma's face flushed, her anger rising as her grip on control slipped. "Fine. If this is the first layer, then where's the rest? Where's the money? Because I don't believe he locked this box for paper alone." The cousins murmured again, curiosity reigniting, but weaker this time, tangled with unease. The boy looked at his grandfather, his small voice trembling. Is there more?" Max looked down at him, his weary eyes softening. "Yes," he said quietly. "There is more, but not what they're hoping for." His hand moved deeper into the box, brushing aside the bus tickets, the ration coupons, the faded receipts. Beneath them lay another bundle tied neatly with twine thicker, heavier. The family leaned forward again, breath caught. Emma's eyes widened, her hunger rekindled. "There," she hissed. "I knew it. That's where the real treasure is." Max lifted the bundle, slowly holding it above the box. The twine cut across the worn paper like veins binding decades together. The fire crackled, the storm moaned, and the family held their breath. The first layer had spoken scraps of sacrifice, dismissed as garbage by some, revered as testimony by others. But the second layer weighted heavier still. Max held the bundle high enough for the firelight to catch the edges of the paper. The twine around it was rough and frayed, darkened from years of dust and touch. The family leaned closer, their breath quick, their eyes bright with hunger. Emma's lips curled into a sharp smile. "There," she said, almost gloating. "I knew it. That's where you've been hiding it. What is it, Dad? Savings bonds?" "A will, insurance papers." The cousins nodded eagerly, their chairs scraping closer. One uncle leaned so far forward his glasses nearly slid from his nose. But Max's expression was not triumphant. It was tender, wistful. His eyes softened, and for a moment the decades fell away. He was no longer the weary man with silver hair and lined skin. He was the husband who had once written by candlelight, his heart spilling into ink. He set the bundle gently on the table. The boy's eyes widened. "What is it?" Grandpa Max's fingers trembled as he tugged at the knot of twine. It gave way with a faint snap, the sound small but sharp, like the breaking of silence itself. He peeled back the layers of brittle paper, revealing dozens of envelopes, each worn at the corners, each marked with the same handwriting, his own. "They're letters," Max said quietly. "Letters to your grandmother, written when she was alive and after she was gone." The room hushed. Even Emma's smirk faltered. He lifted the first envelope, its ink faded but legible. "This one I wrote the night she first fell sick. I told her I was scared. Scared of losing her, scared of raising our boy alone. But I promised her I would never let him feel the weight of that fear." His voice cracked, but he steadied it. "And this one," he continued, picking up another, "was after she passed. I couldn't speak to her anymore, so I wrote. I told her about the nights I worked late, about how our boy was growing, about his first day of school, about how he smiled when I waved at the gate." The boy's lips parted, his small chest rising quickly. You You wrote to Grandma even when she wasn't here. Max's hand brushed the child's hair gently. Yes, because love doesn't stop when a body is gone. It lingers. It needs somewhere to rest. For me, it rested on paper. He spread several letters across the table. The ink varied, some dark and bold, others faint and shaky from late nights when exhaustion nearly claimed him. Words of devotion, of sorrow, of promises made in silence filled the fragile pages. Emma's face tightened. She picked one up, scanning it quickly. So, what love letters? That's what this is, pages and pages of sentimental words. She dropped it back with a scoff. You locked away feelings, that's what you kept from us. Max's gaze turned toward her, steady and unyielding. Yes, because those feelings were the wealth of my life. You measure value in dollars. I measure it in devotion. And this, he tapped the letters softly, is the inheritance I will leave. A cousin muttered under his breath, But there's really no money, Mr. Carter. The neighbor leaned on his cane, his voice sharp. No, there is something far greater. You've all been blind if you cannot see it. Pastor Green nodded, his tone firm. These are vows written in ink, promises carried through storms. They are sacred and they are priceless. Max's son finally lifted his gaze, his face pale. His lips moved, but no sound came. He reached for one letter, his fingers brushing over his father's handwriting. His eyes filled as he read silently, his shoulders trembling. Emma, unwilling to yield, leaned forward. Priceless or not, Pastor, they won't pay off debt collectors. They won't keep a roof over our heads. Her words fell heavy, but they rang emptier than before. The power of the letters had cracked the greed in the room. The cousins no longer looked hungry. They looked ashamed, their gazes flicking between the fragile envelopes and the man who had written them. The boy picked up one letter, gently holding it, as though it might break. Grandpa, he whispered, can I keep one? Max's throat tightened. His hand rested on the boy's. One day, he said, his voice breaking with tenderness. Not yet, but one day they'll be yours. All of them. The storm outside wailed, but inside the room, silence stretched heavy with reverence. The second layer had spoken, and as Max gathered the letters back into a careful stack, his eyes lifted steady and clear. There is still more, he said. The family leaned forward again, their hunger tangled now with awe and fear. And Max reached deeper into the box. The letters lay spread across the table, their ink shimmering faintly in the flicker of firelight. For a moment the room was hushed, as though the air itself bowed to the weight of what had been revealed. But Max's hands, scarred and steady, reached once more into the box. The paper slips shifted beneath his touch. He dug deeper, past the bus tickets, the ration coupons, the letters bound in twine. His fingers found the bottom where the heaviest items rested. Slowly he lifted them out, one by one, setting them gently on the table. First came a thick stack of receipts, hospital bills, their ink faded but still legible. The word paid stamped again and again, though each stamp had been carved from his own strength. He laid them in a neat pile, the pages curling from age. Next came a small folded slip, yellowed and fragile, a pawnshop receipt. Max held it longer than the others, his hand trembling. Then he set it down, his voice low. This is the day I gave away your mother's wedding ring, so I could buy the medicine that kept her alive one more month. A gasp rippled around the table. His son flinched, his lips, parting shame flooding his eyes. Emma shifted uneasily, her face pale. Finally, Max reached down and lifted a bundle wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it, revealing tools worn smooth from decades of use. A hammer with a chipped handle, a wrench rubbed raw where his grip had worn it down, a set of pliers, rusted at the edges. These, Max said, placing them before the family, are the hands of my life made into iron. With these, I built, repaired, carried, and fed. With these, I earned every meal you ate, every roof that covered you, every candle that burned in this home. The boy leaned forward, his small fingers brushing the old hammer with awe. Grandpa, these are yours, Max nodded slowly. Yes, they were the weight I carried so you would not have to. The room fell utterly silent. The storm outside howled, but inside no one moved. The relics on the table spoke louder than Emma's demands, louder than greed, louder even than the witnesses' testimonies. The hospital bills whispered of nights spent in sterile corridors buying time with sweat and sacrifice. The pawn slip carried the echo of a wedding ring traded for life. The tools bore the marks of 40 years steel shaped by flesh iron, softened by love. Emma's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked at the pile of papers, at the slip of pawned gold, at the tools scarred by labor. Her hunger faltered, replaced by unease she could not name. The cousins shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat, his voice hushed. This is what you kept locked away. Max lifted his eyes steady as stone. Yes, because I knew you would not understand until you saw. This is my treasure. Not money, not gold. My treasure is every day I bled for this family. His son swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for the pawn slip. His fingers traced the faded ink, his face stricken. Dad, all these years and you never told me. Max's gaze softened, though his voice held its edge. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to live freely, not under the shadow of what I gave. A father's sacrifice is not meant to be paraded. It is meant to be carried silently. The boy's wide eyes shimmered with tears. He touched the old wrench, reverently whispering, Grandpa, this is better than gold. Max placed his rough hand on the child's shoulder, his throat tightening. One day you will understand fully. These scraps, these tools, these slips of paper, they are worth more than anything you could inherit. Because they are proof. Proof that no one in this family was ever abandoned, not even for a single day. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward. The storm outside raged, but the house was still, the air thick with truth. The box lay empty now, its contents spread across the table like a map of sacrifice. There was nothing left to reveal. No fortune, no hidden wealth. Only a lifetime of devotion written in scars, slips, and steel. Max leaned back slowly, his voice breaking the silence with finality. Now you know what I locked away. Not riches. A life. My life. The words echoed through the room, heavy as iron, soft as prayer. The table was no longer a place for food. The dishes sat cold and untouched, pushed aside to make room for the relics of a lifetime. Hospital bills curled at the edges. The pawn slip lay like a wound reopened. The tools, scarred, rusted, heavy, rested in the firelight, their shadows stretching across the wooden walls. For a long while no one spoke. The storm rattled the windows, the flames hissed, but inside the weight of silence was suffocating. Emma broke it first. Her voice, once sharp with triumph, now wavered. This is all. She gestured at the table with trembling fingers. Old papers, rusty tools, a pawn slip. Her words were brittle, desperate, stripped of the confidence she had worn all night. She looked around at the family for support, but the cousins' eyes were downcast. The hunger that had burned in them earlier was gone, replaced with shame. Mr. Carter, the old neighbor, spoke gruffly. You asked for treasure. He gave it to you. You just don't have the eyes to see it. Mrs. Holloway, the schoolteacher, nodded, her voice quiet but steady. Every one of those scraps is worth more than gold. They are the proof of what we all saw, his devotion. Emma's face flushed red. She pressed her lips together, but no defense came. The room had shifted, and she stood alone in her hunger. Max's son finally raised his head. His eyes, rimmed with tears, locked on the pawn slip. He picked it up with trembling hands, his voice breaking. You sold Mom's ring and you never told me. Max looked at him, his face calm, though his eyes glistened. Because you were a boy. You needed to grow without knowing what was lost, only what was given. The son's shoulders shook. Tears slipped down his cheeks, dripping onto the paper in his hand. He bowed his head, whispering, all these years I thought you were just quiet, just distant. But you were carrying this. All of this. Max's weary hand reached across the table, resting on his son's arm. A father carries so a son can walk free. That was always my vow. The boy, Max's grandson, leaned closer, his small hands gripping the old hammer with reverence. His eyes shone wide and proud. Grandpa, I think this is better than treasure. This is like proof that you were a hero. Max's chest tightened. He pulled the child gently onto his lap, his rough hands steadying him. His voice softened. Not a hero son, just a father. A man who gave what he could. The boy's face lit with pride, his arms wrapping around Max's neck. Emma's voice rose again, but weaker this time. But what about us now? What about the bills, the debt, the future you can't expect us to survive on stories? Max's gaze lifted, his eyes steady, his posture straight despite the years. For the first time that night, his voice rang with power, not weary, not broken, but commanding. You wanted an inheritance, he spread his arms, gesturing to the table. Here it is. Every mile I walked, every meal I gave up, every night I stayed awake, every ring I pawned, every hour I bled into steel. My sacrifice. My proof. This is what I leave you, and it cannot be spent. The words struck like thunder. The room fell silent. No one moved. The fire crackled. The storm outside roared. Emma's mouth opened, then closed. No retort came. Her face burned crimson, her pride stripped bare before the family. Max's son wept openly now, clutching the pawn slip to his chest. The cousins sat silent, some ashamed, some humbled, their hunger dissolved into respect. And the boy nestled against Max's chest, whispered into his ear, I'll never forget, Grandpa. I promise. Max closed his eyes, the weight of the years pressing down, but his heart lighter than it had been in decades. The box lay open, emptied at last, its truth spread wide for all to see. The trial was over. The humiliation had turned not on him, but on those who had doubted. And Max's final words still rang in the air, it cannot be spent. The storm outside raged on, but inside the house the tempest had passed. The table, once heavy with food and greed, now held something far heavier, the story of a lifetime laid bare. Bus tickets, ration slips, letters inked in devotion, hospital bills, a pawn receipt, tools worn smooth by sacrifice, all spread across the wood like relics of a saint. No one dared touch them now. The cousins who had leaned forward with hungry eyes sat back in their chairs, shame creeping across their faces. One by one they pushed their bowls away, no appetite left in them. A murmur of excuses rose. It's late. The roads will be bad with the snow. Chairs scraped, coats were pulled on, and the air filled with the rustle of retreat. Emma stood stiffly, her cheeks still burning. She gathered her son's jacket, muttering something about early appointments. But when her gaze met Max's, she faltered. No sharp words, came no triumph. Only the silence of someone who had been revealed and found wanting. Max did not answer her silence. He simply nodded once, a gesture neither cruel nor soft but final. Emma turned quickly, ushering her husband out. His eyes lingered on the table, wet with tears, before he followed her into the storm. One by one the relatives left. Some bowed their heads slightly toward Max, ashamed but unwilling to voice it. Others avoided his gaze altogether, retreating into the night without farewell. The house grew quieter with every closing door until only a handful remained. Mr. Carter leaned on his cane, his voice rough. You held your ground tonight, Max. Not many could have borne it, but you did. Mrs. Holloway nodded, her eyes glistening. You gave them something they didn't expect, not wealth, but truth. Whether they admit it or not, they'll carry it with them. Pastor Green placed a hand gently on Max's shoulder. Your life is your testament. Tonight it was read aloud. Max gave them each a faint smile, weary but grateful. Thank you for remembering what they chose to forget. The witnesses departed, their words lingering like blessings in the smoke-filled air. At last the house was nearly empty. Only the crackle of the fire remained, and the steady breathing of the boy curled against Max's side. The child's small hand rested on the old wrench, as if guarding it, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Max stroked the boy's hair gently, his calloused fingers brushing through the soft strands. You see now, he whispered, what treasure really is. The boy nodded sleepily, his eyelids heavy. I do, Grandpa. I won't forget. I promise. Max leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night settling into his bones. The storm outside beat against the windows, but inside warmth returned. The firelight flickered across the table, dancing over the artifacts of sacrifice. For the first time in many years, Max felt something stir in his chest, not bitterness, not exhaustion, but peace. The box was open. The truth was known. And though not everyone would honor it, enough had seen. Enough had understood. The boy's breathing slowed soft and steady as he drifted into sleep. Max closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire, the whisper of snow against the roof, the steady rhythm of a child's trust. The storm would pass, and what remained would endure. The storm had broken by dawn. The snow lay thick across the yard, white and unbroken, muffling the world in silence. The house stood still, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Inside, Max rose stiffly from his chair by the fire, his grandson still curled in blankets, the old wrench clutched protectively in his small hands. Max's joints ached, but his heart felt lighter. The box sat open on the table, its contents still spread in solemn display. In the morning light, the bus tickets looked even more fragile, the letters more intimate, the tools more sacred. A knock came at the door. Max opened it to find Mr. Carter, his cane planted firmly in the snow, flanked by two other neighbors. Behind them, Mrs. Holloway trudged up the path, her scarf pulled tight, carrying a small tin of bread. We heard one neighbor said softly, "Word travels fast. They said you opened the box." Max gave a weary nod. "Yes." They saw. Mrs. Holloway's eyes softened as she stepped inside. Plant the table, and what they saw has already reached the town. People are speaking, Max. They're saying last night you showed the true wealth of a man's life. More neighbors arrived as the morning wore on, stamping snow from their boots, bringing small offerings, breadfruit, a thermos of hot tea. They gathered in the warm kitchen, their voices hushed, their eyes drifting again and again toward the relics spread on the table. Mr. Lopez, the old co-worker, clasped Max's hand firmly. "I told them about the wages you gave me that winter. They shook their heads, said they hadn't known. Now they do." Pastor Green stepped forward, his voice carrying calm authority. "I will speak of this on Sunday. Not of money or inheritance, but of legacy. Of how sacrifice builds what greed can never keep." Max bowed, his head humbled. "I never wanted praise. I only wanted my family to have enough. And they did," Mrs. Holloway said gently, "because you gave until there was nothing left to give." The boy stirred awake, on the chair, rubbing his eyes. He blinked at the room full of visitors, then looked up at his grandfather. "Grandpa, why are so many people here?" Max lifted him into his lap, his weary arms still strong enough to hold him. "Because, son," he said quietly, "sometimes the truth cannot stay hidden. Once it's seen, it spreads." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching the wrench to his chest as if it were a medal. One neighbor, younger and wide-eyed, pointed at the box. "It's strange, isn't it? We live our lives chasing after things that shine. But this feels brighter than gold." Pastor Green smiled faintly. "Because gold feeds only the hand. Sacrifice feeds the soul." The room grew still again, the truth sitting heavy but warm. Max's son appeared in the doorway, then his face pale, his eyes rimmed red. He looked at the table, then at his father, shame weighing him down. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward, bowed his head, and whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry." The words trembled in the air, fragile but real. Max studied him, the years of silence and distance etched between them. Then he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the grip firm but forgiving. "It is never too late to see," he said softly. The fire crackled, the neighbors bowed their heads, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel like a place of solitude. It felt like a sanctuary. The box had been opened. The truth had spread. And with it came something Max had not expected, not pity, not judgment, but dignity restored. By afternoon, the storm had passed entirely, leaving the town blanketed in white. Sunlight glittered across the drifts, spilling through the frosted windows of Max's house and bathing the room in soft gold. The relics on the table, bus tickets, rations, slips, letters, bills, and tools, glowed faintly in the light, as though the morning had transfigured them into icons. The neighbors lingered, their voices warm and reverent. Word of the night before had already traveled. Some stopped by simply to shake Max's hand, others to press his shoulder and murmur words of respect. One young man whispered, "My father worked beside you. He always said you gave more than anyone else." I see now, he was right. Max bowed his head in quiet humility. He had never sought recognition. He had only wanted his family to have enough. Yet here was a community bearing witness, and the weight of years seemed lighter under their gaze. His grandson climbed into a chair, his small frame dwarfed by the pile of papers and tools. He picked up the pawn slip with careful fingers, staring at the faded ink. Then he looked at Max, his voice steady in a way that surprised everyone. "Grandpa," he said, "I'll keep this safe. All of it. I'll tell people about it just like you told me. I'll make sure nobody forgets." The room hushed, every adult pausing. The boy's words carried more than innocence. They carried a vow. Max's throat tightened. He reached out, resting his rough hand on the boy's shoulder. "One day," he said softly, "this box will be yours. Not because it holds money, but because it holds truth. Guard it not for wealth, but for memory." The boy nodded fiercely, his young eyes shining with pride. "I will. I promise." Emma's absence lingered like a shadow, but no one mentioned her. The memory of her sharp words had already begun to fade under the weight of what had been revealed. Even Max's son, still subdued, sat near the fire with his head bowed, saying little but carrying the look of a man who had finally glimpsed the depth of his father's life. Pastor Green spoke once more, his voice calm but firm. "Last night some of you demanded riches. Today we have seen something greater. Let it be known that Max's inheritance is not measured in coins but in character, and that is the only legacy that endures." A murmur of agreement filled the room. Some clapped Max gently on the back, others wiped their eyes. Respect had replaced curiosity, dignity had replaced hunger. Max looked at the open box, its contents spread across the table like a book finally read aloud. His hands, trembling but steady, began to gather them again. The slips, the letters, the bills, the tools. One by one he placed them back into the box, each item a piece of his life restored to its vessel. When the last paper was tucked inside, Max lowered the lid slowly. The wood groaned faintly as it closed, not with secrecy this time, but with peace. He set the key beside it, untouched, a symbol that nothing here was hidden anymore. The boy leaned against him, resting his head on Max's arm. "Grandpa," he whispered now, "I know what treasure really is." Max smiled faintly, the corners of his weary eyes softening. "Yes, son, now you do." The fire crackled. The neighbors lingered a moment longer, then departed into the sunlight, leaving Max, his son, and his grandson alone in the quiet house. The storm had passed. The truth had been spoken. And for the first time in decades, Max felt the burden of silence lift from his shoulders. The box was closed, not to hide, but to rest. The winter sun slipped behind the hills early, leaving the house wrapped in dusk. The neighbors had gone. The boy was asleep in his room, and Max's son sat quietly by the fire, still heavy with unspoken words. The house was hushed, the kind of silence that feels like reverence. Max rose slowly, his joints aching from the long night and day. In his hand he carried a single letter from the bundle, the one he had written the night Anna passed. The paper was creased and thin, the ink blurred where his tears had fallen decades ago. He moved to the corner of the room where Anna's shrine stood. Her photograph, framed in simple wood, gazed back at him. A younger woman, her eyes warm, her smile radiant. Fresh incense smoldered its smoke, curling upward, carrying memory into the air. Max knelt before the shrine, his knees stiff against the wooden floor. He laid the letter gently before her picture, smoothing it flat with trembling hands. His voice was low but steady, as if speaking to someone still present. "Anna," he whispered, "they saw. At last they saw." His eyes lingered on her smile, and for a moment he could almost hear her laugh again, light and steady as it had been when the world was still kind. "I kept these letters because they were all I had left of you," he continued. "But last night I let them see. I let them read the truth of our life. The nights, the hunger, the storms, the sacrifices no one else knew. They called it treasure, then called it trash. But in the end, they understood. At least some did. His throat tightened, his hand pressing flat against the letter. I promised you I would carry our boy. And I did. Even when it cost me everything. I never remarried. I never turned from the vow we made. I carried it all, Anna. For him. For us. The candlelight flickered shadows dancing across her face in the photograph. Max bowed his head, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, his prayer was not for strength, but for release. The box is open now. The truth is no longer mine alone. It belongs to them, to the boy, to the future. I can rest a little easier knowing they finally know what it costs. He stayed there a long time, the smell of incense mingling with the warmth of memory. At last he lifted his gaze to her picture, his weary eyes glistening. I did all I could, Anna. I hope it was enough. Behind him, footsteps creaked softly. His son stood in the doorway, watching quietly. He didn't speak, but his face was wet with tears. Max met his eyes, and for the first time in decades, no words were needed. The silence between them was no longer distance. It was understanding. Max turned back to the shrine, his hand brushing lightly over the letter. Rest easy, Anna. They know now. They finally know. The candle flame steadied as if in answer. Max rose slowly, his body weary but his spirit lighter. He extinguished the incense, leaving the faintest wisp of smoke trailing upward. Then he returned to the fire where his son sat waiting, and lowered himself into the chair with a sigh that carried not sorrow but peace. The house was quiet, the storm gone, the truth spoken. For the first time in many years, Max felt free. The morning after was calm, the storm washed clean from the sky. The snow in the yard glittered under the pale sun, untouched, pure as a blank page. Max stepped outside, his grandson bundled in a thick coat at his side. The boy's hand slipped into his small but certain, and together they walked across the yard where the snow crunched softly beneath their boots. The air was sharp with cold but fresh, filling Max's lungs like a gift. He paused near the old shed, where his tools once hung in neat rows. Most were gone now, replaced by newer ones, but the echoes of labor still lived there in the worn beams and the scent of wood and iron that lingered even through winter. The boy tugged at his sleeve. Grandpa, he said, his breath puffing white in the air, someday when I'm older. Will you show me all the letters, all the things in the box? Max smiled faintly, his silver hair catching the sunlight. He squeezed the boy's hand gently. Yes. Someday. And when that day comes, you'll understand not just what's in the box, but why it mattered. The boy nodded with the solemnity only a child can carry, as if he had just been entrusted with a secret map. His small hand clutched tighter to Max's, as though to promise he would never let go. From across the yard, Max's son watched quietly. His face was still pale with shame, but softened now with something else, respect, perhaps even redemption. He bowed his head slightly when Max glanced at him, a gesture that spoke what words could not. The snow crunched again as Max and the boy returned to the porch. They paused by the door, the house behind them glowing in the winter sun. Max knelt slowly, his knees stiff, until his eyes met his grandson's. You asked me once why I locked the box, Max said softly. The truth is, I wasn't locking it to keep you out. I was keeping it safe, waiting for the right eyes to see it. And now you have. The boy's eyes shone, his breath trembling. I'll keep it safe too, Grandpa. I promise. Max placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder, his voice low but strong. Good. Because the greatest inheritance is not money. It is memory. And memory must be guarded. For a moment they stood together in the quiet morning. Then Max straightened, lifting his gaze to the sky where the clouds broke apart, light spilling across the snow. His heart, long burdened by silence, felt light. He whispered, as though to Anna, as though to the ancestors, as though to everyone who had ever doubted. Now they know. The words carried into the cold air, soft but final, and with them came peace. And to you, dear listener, who have walked this journey with us, thank you. Thank you for your time, your heart, and your presence here. May this story remind us all that sacrifice is never wasted, and that love, though unseen, is the greatest legacy we leave behind. Take care of yourselves. Treasure your families. And may your homes always be filled with health, warmth, and love. Until next time, stay well and stay blessed.